Flight 447 was landing normally. Then both brake systems failed. The pilots had 90 seconds before 237 people would crash at deadly speed. A random passenger knocked on the cockpit door. What she did next saved everyone. And when military pilots learned her name, they couldn't believe it. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cabin of Transcontinental Flight 447 as it began its descent toward Denver International Airport. Among the 237 passengers, most were gathering their belongings, folding their tray tables, and returning their seats to the upright position with the practiced efficiency of experienced travelers. In seat 23C, a woman in her late 30s sat quietly, her carry-on already stowed, her seatbelt fastened long before the announcement. She wore jeans and a plain gray sweater, her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, reading glasses perched on her nose as she studied what appeared to be a technical manual. To the businessman beside her and the family across the aisle, she was utterly unremarkable, just another passenger eager to reach her destination after a long cross-country flight from Washington Dulles. Her name was Maya Richardson, though that name appeared on no military roster, no published research paper, no public database of any significance. The identification in her wallet identified her as a systems analyst for a defense contractor, which was technically true in the way that describing the ocean as damp was technically accurate. What the ID didn't mention was that she held 3 records for high-altitude flight testing, had landed more aircraft types than most people could name, and possessed a call sign that existed in only the most classified aviation databases in the United States military. She traveled this way often, anonymously, deliberately unremarkable, a shadow moving through the world of commercial aviation while carrying knowledge that could fill volumes about what aircraft could and couldn't survive. The Boeing 767 tilted gently as it turned onto its final approach, and Maya felt the subtle change in engine tone that signaled the beginning of the landing sequence. Flight attendants moved through the aisles with their final checks, their smiles professional and reassuring. In the cockpit, Captain David Morrison and First Officer Jennifer Chen were running through their landing checklist with the smooth coordination of a crew that had flown together for 3 years. The weather was perfect, visibility unlimited, winds light and favorable. It was the kind of approach that made flying seem routine, almost boring in its predictability. The passengers around Maya were already planning their ground transportation, checking their phones in anticipation of cellular service, making the mental transition from sky to earth that marked the end of every flight. Maya closed her manual but didn't relax. Something about the descent pattern felt wrong, though she couldn't immediately identify what had triggered her instinct. She'd learned long ago to trust these subtle warnings, the accumulated wisdom of thousands of hours in cockpits where the difference between normal and catastrophic could be measured in fractions of degrees or milliseconds of response time. She listened to the engine sound, felt the aircraft's attitude through the seat, monitored the rate of descent through the practiced awareness that came from flying aircraft to their absolute limits and sometimes beyond. The 767 was stable, the approach textbook perfect, but somewhere in the symphony of flight, a note was wrong. In the cockpit, Captain Morrison called for flaps 30 and watched as his instruments confirmed the deployment. The runway was visible now, a massive concrete ribbon stretching across the high desert landscape, its markings sharp and clear in the afternoon light. Landing checklist complete, First Officer Chen announced, her hands ready on the controls, her scan moving across the instruments with the rhythm of countless approaches. They were at 2,000 feet, speed under control, descent rate perfect, aligned with the centerline. Morrison keyed the radio and received landing clearance from tower control, the familiar exchange that marked the final phase of flight. Everything was exactly as it should be. Maya felt the landing gear deploy, heard the distinctive thunk and whine of the massive wheels lowering into the slipstream. The aircraft's drag increased slightly, the nose pitching down fractionally before the pilots trimmed it out. Still that nagging sense of something wrong, like a word on the tip of her tongue, a pattern her subconscious recognized before her conscious mind could process. She found herself leaning forward slightly, her body tensing in ways that had nothing to do with landing anxiety and everything to do with threat assessment. Around her, passengers continued their pre-landing rituals, oblivious to anything unusual, trusting in the professionalism of the crew and the reliability of modern aviation. At 1,000 feet, Captain Morrison's eyes flickered to the brake pressure indicators on his instrument panel, and his hand froze halfway to the thrust levers. The gauges that should have shown normal hydraulic pressure in the brake systems were reading 0. Both of them, primary and backup. He blinked, certain his eyes were deceiving him, but the needles remained stubbornly at the bottom of their arcs. "Jenny, check brake hydraulics," he said, his voice still calm but with an edge that made his first officer's head snap toward the indicators. She stared at them for 2 full seconds, her mind refusing to accept what her eyes were showing her. "Both brake hydraulic systems showing 0 pressure," she said, her voice tight. "That's not possible. We had normal indications at the last check." Her hands moved across the panel, cycling the systems, checking circuit breakers, trying to find the malfunction that would explain why every brake hydraulic system on the aircraft was suddenly registering complete failure. Morrison was already reaching for the emergency checklist, his mind racing through the implications. Without brakes, they couldn't stop after touchdown. The 767 would roll off the end of the runway at over 100 knots, 250,000 pounds of metal and fuel and human beings with no way to arrest its momentum. "Tower, Transcon 447, we have an indication of complete brake system failure," Morrison transmitted, forcing his voice to remain steady even as his pulse hammered in his ears. "Requesting emergency equipment and longest available runway." The response came immediately, the controller's professional calm masking what both pilots knew was a recognition of catastrophe in progress. They were cleared to land on runway 16 R34L, the longest at Denver International, nearly 13,000 feet of concrete that suddenly seemed inadequate for an aircraft that couldn't stop. Maya heard the transmission through the slight crackle of the PA system, though most passengers missed it or didn't understand its significance. But she understood immediately, her body going rigid as the implications cascaded through her tactical mind. Complete brake system failure on a heavy jet. She'd simulated it, studied it, written classified papers on it, but she'd never encountered it in actual flight because it shouldn't be possible. Modern aircraft had redundant brake systems, multiple hydraulic sources, fail-safes upon fail-safes. For both systems to fail simultaneously suggested something catastrophic, a maintenance error or design flaw or sabotage that had eliminated every backup. First Officer Chen was cycling through the emergency procedures, her voice steady as she read aloud the steps they'd practiced in simulators but never expected to encounter. Alternate brake systems, attempt activation. Morrison followed the procedure, knowing already it would fail. The brake pedals under his feet had no resistance, no feedback, just empty space where there should have been hydraulic pressure. "No response," he confirmed. "Parking brake." Chen tried the backup system, got the same result. Nothing. They were committed now, descending through 500 feet toward a runway where they would land with no ability to stop. "What about reverse thrust?" Chen asked, though she already knew the answer wouldn't be enough. "Maximum reverse thrust and we're still looking at running off the end," Morrison replied, his calculator mind running the physics. The 767 was heavy, they'd taken on full fuel for the cross-country flight and burned less than expected due to favorable winds. Reverse thrust could slow them, but not stop them, not in 13,000 feet. They needed something more, something beyond the standard procedures, beyond the training that every commercial pilot received. They needed a miracle, or they needed someone who'd faced impossible aviation emergencies and survived. Maya was already unclipping her seatbelt, her body moving before her conscious mind had fully processed the decision. The flight attendant noticed immediately, moving toward her with a professionally concerned expression. "Ma'am, we're on final approach, you need to remain seated with your seatbelt fastened." Maya met her eyes with an intensity that stopped the attendant mid-stride. "I need to speak to the pilots immediately. I'm a military test pilot with emergency landing expertise. They have brake failure and they're going to need help they don't have." The words were delivered with such absolute certainty, such complete authority, that the flight attendant found herself nodding even as her training screamed that passengers never, ever went to the cockpit during an emergency. In the cockpit, Morrison and Chen were 300 feet above the runway, committed to landing with no way to stop, when they heard the knock on the reinforced door. Morrison nearly ignored it, his entire focus on the approaching concrete, but the intercom crackled with the lead flight attendant's voice, and what she said made no sense. "Captain, there's a passenger who says she's a military test pilot and she can help with the brake failure." Morrison and Chen exchanged glances, the same thought crossing both minds. Someone trying to break into the cockpit during an emergency, possibly someone who'd caused the brake failure. But something in the attendant's tone suggested she believed this passenger, and they had approximately 90 seconds until touchdown with no solution. Let her in, Morrison decided, and a moment later Maya was squeezing into the cramped cockpit, her eyes sweeping across the instruments with a speed that spoke of intimate familiarity. "Maya Richardson, call sign Valor, former test pilot at Edwards," she said rapidly, dispensing with any pretense of introduction. "I've landed aircraft without brakes in combat damage scenarios. You're going to touch down normally, but immediately on main gear contact you need maximum reverse thrust on all engines, not standard procedure but full power reverse. Then you're going to execute a controlled ground loop using asymmetric reverse thrust and nose-wheel steering." Morrison stared at her, his brain trying to process what she was suggesting. A ground loop was what you did everything possible to avoid, a dangerous maneuver where the aircraft spun laterally on the runway, bleeding off energy through friction and drag in ways never intended by the designers. "That'll tear the landing gear apart," he said, even as his hands prepared for touchdown, now 50 feet above the runway. "Better than tearing the fuselage apart when you run off the end at 80 knots, Maya replied, her voice carrying the absolute certainty of someone who'd survived situations that would have killed others. "Trust me, I've done this in aircraft with worse handling characteristics than a 767. There was no time for debate, no time for verification of credentials or consultation with dispatch. The main gear touched down with the gentle chirp of rubber on concrete, and Morrison was already reaching for the thrust levers, pulling them into full reverse. The engines roared, their sound changing from the smooth whoosh of forward thrust to the violent thunder of reversed airflow. The aircraft began to slow, but not nearly fast enough, the nose gear still in the air as Chen fought to keep them aligned with the centerline. "Nose wheel down now," Maya commanded, and Chen complied, feeling the third set of wheels contact the runway. "You're passing 90 knots with 9,000 feet of runway remaining," Maya said, her voice utterly calm despite the catastrophe unfolding at 100 miles per hour. "At my mark, you're going to reduce reverse thrust on engine 1 to idle while maintaining full reverse on engine 2. The aircraft will want to your right, you'll counter with full left nose wheel steering, but let her start the turn. You're going to enter a controlled ground loop that'll scrub off the remaining energy." Morrison's hands were sweating on the thrust levers, every instinct screaming that what she was suggesting violated every principle of runway operations, but he could see the end of the runway approaching with terrible speed, could see the rough terrain beyond where the aircraft would disintegrate. 80 knots, 7,000 feet remaining, Maya continued, her internal calculations running at computational speed. She'd done this in an F-15 with battle damage over the Nevada desert, had landed a prototype unmanned aircraft without brakes on a runway half this length, had written the classified manual on emergency landing techniques that existed in exactly 3 locations in the United States. She knew the physics, knew the stress limits of the landing gear, knew exactly how much lateral force the tires could handle before failure. "Now," she said, and Morrison pulled engine 1's thrust lever to idle while Chen pushed the nose wheel steering to its maximum left deflection. The 767 began to yaw, its nose swinging right as the asymmetric thrust created a powerful turning moment. The passengers screamed as their world tilted, luggage tumbling from overhead bins, the aircraft sliding sideways down the runway in a maneuver that seemed certain to end in catastrophic structural failure. But Maya had calculated it perfectly, the ground loop creating massive drag as the tires scraped laterally across the concrete, the landing gear flexing and groaning but holding, the aircraft bleeding off speed at a rate that no amount of braking could have achieved. 60 knots, 4,000 feet remaining, Maya called out, her voice the only calm thing in the chaos. Reduce reverse thrust on engine 2, bring it down gradually, ease out of the turn. Morrison followed her instructions with hands that had gone from terrified to trusting, recognizing in her voice the same tone that training instructors used when they were absolutely certain of the physics. The aircraft began to straighten, still sliding laterally but less violently, the ground loop transitioning to something more like a controlled skid. 50 knots, 3,000 feet of runway. 40 knots, 2,000 feet. The screaming in the cabin had given way to terrified silence, everyone gripping their armrests with white-knuckled intensity, certain they were about to die but unable to do anything except trust in the pilots they couldn't see. 30 knots, 1,000 feet of runway remaining, and the aircraft was still moving, still rolling toward the end where the concrete gave way to dirt and rocks. Reverse thrust to idle on both engines, full nosewheel steering left again. We're going to do one more controlled yaw to kill the last of the energy, Maya said, and Morrison complied without hesitation. The nose swung left this time, gentler than before, the aircraft pivoting around its main gear, and suddenly they were slowing rapidly, the last of their momentum bleeding away into friction and heat and rubber particles scattered across hundreds of feet of runway. 20 knots, 500 feet from the end. 10 knots, 300 feet. 5 knots, 200 feet. And then they were stopped, the 767 sitting at an angle across the runway, its landing gear intact, its fuselage undamaged, all 237 passengers alive when by every conventional calculation they should have been dead. The cockpit was silent except for the winding down of the engines and the heavy breathing of three people who just defied physics and probability. Morrison's hands were shaking on the controls, Chen was crying softly in the right seat, and Maya was already moving toward the door, her job done, her intervention complete. "You'll want to evacuate using slides," she said matter-of-factly. "That landing gear took a lot of stress, I wouldn't trust it to hold the aircraft's weight for extended ground operations. And you'll want to have maintenance check for hydraulic line damage, possibly a catastrophic seal failure in the brake system actuators, could be a manufacturing defect or maintenance error during the last service cycle." Morrison turned to look at her, this woman who'd appeared from nowhere and saved everyone aboard his aircraft. "Who are you?" he asked, though she'd already given her name. "I told you, Maya Richardson, call sign Valor," she replied, and something in the way she said the call sign made Morrison realize there was a story there, something significant that he couldn't quite grasp. But before he could ask anything else, she was gone, slipping out of the cockpit as the evacuation announcement began, blending back into the crowd of passengers who were now sliding down the emergency chutes into the arms of firefighters and paramedics who'd arrived expecting to find wreckage and bodies. 10 miles away, at Buckley Space Force Base, two F-22 Raptor pilots were monitoring the emergency frequency when they heard the tower controller's report of the successful emergency landing. Captain Jake Hawk Harrison and Major Lisa Ghost Chen had been conducting routine training operations when the emergency call came through, and they'd held position at altitude, ready to provide reconnaissance or escort if needed. Now they listened as the tower confirmed all passengers safe, the aircraft intact, the disaster averted through what the controller described as extraordinary piloting that defied standard procedures. Harrison was about to switch frequencies when he heard a ground controller mention a passenger's name in communication with the Airport Operations Center, something about needing to verify credentials for an incident report. Passenger identified herself as Maya Richardson, said she was a test pilot with call sign Valor who provided emergency landing guidance. Harrison's hand froze on the radio selector, his eyes going wide behind his visor. "Did he just say Valor?" Ghost asked from the other F-22, her voice carrying the same shock that Harrison felt. "He did," Harrison confirmed, his mind racing through the implications. In the world of military aviation, certain call signs carried weight beyond mere identification. They represented achievements so extraordinary, contributions so significant, that they became legend among pilots who'd never met their owners. Valor was one of those call signs, whispered in ready rooms and mentioned in classified briefings as an example of what the absolute pinnacle of test pilot capability looked like. Harrison had never met Valor, didn't know her real name until this moment, but he knew the stories. The emergency landing of a damaged F-15 that should have resulted in ejection and aircraft loss. The first successful landing of an experimental unmanned combat vehicle after its autonomous systems failed. The development of emergency procedures for brake failure scenarios that have been adopted across multiple aircraft platforms. Tower, Raptor 2-1 requesting confirmation, Harrison transmitted, his voice formal now, carrying a weight that made the controller pause. Can you verify the passenger's call sign was Valor? There was a moment of silence, then the controller's response. Confirmed, passenger stated her call sign was Valor, claimed to be former military test pilot who assisted cockpit crew with brake failure emergency. Harrison glanced at his wingman's F-22 flying in formation beside him, saw her aircraft rock slightly as Ghost adjusted her position, and knew she was processing the same information. In fighter pilot culture, there were traditions that went beyond regulations or procedures, customs that connected the warriors of the sky across generations and platforms. One of those traditions was that when you encountered someone whose achievements dwarfed your own, someone whose contributions to aviation had literally changed how aircraft were flown, you showed respect in the only way that truly mattered to pilots. Ghost, you thinking what I'm thinking? Harrison asked over their private frequency. Definitely, she replied. Valor just saved 200 people using techniques she pioneered. That deserves recognition. Both F-22 pilots brought their aircraft to attention, a maneuver that had no official definition but that every fighter pilot understood. They pulled their stealth fighters into perfect formation, wings level, noses aligned, holding a precision that would have satisfied the most demanding flight instructor. It was a gesture that said, without words, that they recognized they were in the presence of someone whose skill exceeded their own, whose achievements had earned a respect that transcended rank or position. They held the formation for a full minute, two of the most advanced fighters ever built standing at attention in honor of a pilot they'd never met but whose legend they knew well. On the ground, Maya was sitting on the back of an ambulance, declining medical attention despite the paramedics' insistence that anyone who'd been in the cockpit during that landing should be evaluated for stress reactions. She felt fine, actually better than fine, the clarity that came from executing a difficult maneuver perfectly still singing through her veins. An airport operations supervisor was approaching with a clipboard and an expression that suggested he had many questions that Maya had no intention of answering completely. She'd give them enough for their incident report, enough to satisfy the FAA investigation that would inevitably follow, but not enough to blow her cover or complicate the work she still needed to do. Captain Morrison emerged from the debriefing tent, saw Maya, and walked over with the determined stride of someone who wanted answers. The FAA investigator wants to interview you, he said without preamble. They're very interested in how a passenger happened to know advanced emergency landing techniques that aren't part of any commercial pilot training. Maya smiled slightly, the expression not quite reaching her eyes. I imagine they are. I'll talk to them, provide what I can. But some of what I know is classified, part of programs that don't officially exist. They'll have to settle for the unclassified version. Morrison studied her, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time, this woman who'd appeared from nowhere with knowledge that had saved his aircraft and everyone aboard. The investigators found something interesting in the maintenance logs, he said carefully. The brake hydraulic systems were serviced 2 days ago, and the logs show some irregularities in the work order. They're thinking maybe a mechanic made an error, installed a seal backwards or didn't properly bleed the lines. Your suggestion about checking for seal failure might have just prevented this from happening to another aircraft. Maya nodded, unsurprised. She'd seen it before, tiny human errors cascading into catastrophic system failures, the kind of thing that happened when maintenance procedures weren't followed exactly or when mechanics were rushed or when quality control failed. They'll want to issue an airworthiness directive, probably ground all 767s with that brake system configuration until they can inspect every aircraft, she said. It's the right call. Better to inconvenience passengers than to have another crew face what you just faced. Morrison agreed, though part of him wondered how many crews would have survived without someone like Maya aboard. High above, Harrison and Ghost had returned to their training mission, but both pilots were distracted by what they'd witnessed. "I'm going to submit a recognition report," Harrison said over their private frequency. "What Valor did today deserves documentation, even if it stays classified." Ghost agreed, already thinking about how to word the report to capture the significance without compromising operational security. They'd both been part of test programs, had pushed aircraft to their limits and sometimes beyond, but neither had ever done anything like landing a commercial airliner without brakes using techniques that violated every standard procedure. That took a combination of knowledge, skill, and courage that existed in perhaps a handful of pilots worldwide. Back at the airport, the first television news crews were arriving, their cameras focusing on the 767 sitting askew on the runway, emergency slides still deployed, passengers being interviewed about their brush with death. Maya watched from a distance, knowing her face would appear in some of the footage, knowing that her anonymity had just taken a significant hit. She'd have to file a report with her current command, explain why her cover as a defense contractor systems analyst had been compromised, accept whatever operational changes that required. It was a complication, but not one she regretted. 237 people were alive who would have been dead, and that calculation justified almost any compromise of operational security. The FAA investigator was a woman in her 50s named Patricia Connors, and she had the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd spent 30 years examining aircraft accidents and didn't easily accept explanations that seemed too convenient. She sat across from Maya in a borrowed office at the Airport Operations Center, a voice recorder running on the table between them, her eyes sharp and evaluating. "Ms. Richardson, your assistance in the cockpit during the brake failure emergency was clearly instrumental in preventing a catastrophic accident," Connors began, her tone neutral. "However, I need to understand how a passenger happened to possess the specific knowledge required to guide a controlled ground loop landing of a commercial airliner." Maya had prepared for this conversation during the hour since the landing, had decided how much she could reveal without requiring classified briefings or invoking national security protocols that would complicate the investigation. "I'm a test pilot by training and experience," she said simply. "I spent 12 years flying experimental aircraft for various military programs, including several that focused on emergency landing procedures and aircraft handling in degraded conditions. Brake failure scenarios were part of my testing portfolio, and I developed techniques for landing aircraft without functional brakes that have been incorporated into some military training programs." Connors wrote notes on her tablet, her expression suggesting she was hearing exactly what she'd expected but still found remarkable. "Can you provide specifics about which programs or which aircraft you tested?" she asked, and Maya shook her head gently. "Some of my work remains classified. I can tell you that I've landed everything from small fighters to large cargo aircraft in various emergency configurations, and that brake system failures were among the scenarios I studied extensively. The techniques I use today, specifically the controlled ground loop using asymmetric reverse thrust, are documented in several unclassified aviation journals under my name, though they're not part of standard commercial pilot training because they're considered too risky for routine application." The investigator considered this, clearly wanting more details but recognizing the wall she'd just hit. "The FAA will want to interview you further, possibly with cleared personnel who can discuss the classified aspects," Connors said. "We'll also need documentation of your flight credentials and your current employment status." Maya provided her pilot's license number, which showed credentials for aircraft types that made Connors's eyebrows rise, and a phone number for her current supervisor at the defense contractor that would route through several layers of security before reaching someone who could confirm her bona fides without revealing operational details. As the interview concluded, Connors looked at Maya with an expression that mixed professional skepticism with genuine respect. "In 30 years of investigating accidents, I've never seen anything quite like what happened today," she admitted. "By any conventional analysis, Transcon 447 should have run off the runway at high speed, probably resulted in multiple fatalities and aircraft destruction. Instead, everyone walked away without serious injury because you happened to be aboard and happened to know techniques that maybe 10 pilots in the world could execute successfully. That's either the most remarkable coincidence I've ever encountered, or there's more to this story than you're telling me." Maya smiled, the expression enigmatic. "Sometimes coincidence and providence are difficult to distinguish," she said, which was both perfectly true and completely uninformative. She left the operations center as the sun was setting, painting the Colorado sky in shades of amber and crimson, the 767 now surrounded by investigators and mechanics beginning the process of understanding exactly how the brake system had failed so catastrophically. She knew what they'd find, could have written their report before they'd completed their examination, but that wasn't her job anymore. She'd moved beyond accident investigation into other work, other missions that took her through the world of commercial aviation while serving purposes that existed in classified briefings and secure facilities. Her phone vibrated with a text message from a number that showed only as a string of digits, no name attached. The message was brief: Valor, confirmation received of incident at DIA. Well done. Recommend you return to base for debrief and reassignment. Your current cover may be compromised. Maya typed a quick acknowledgement and began walking toward the rental car facility, her mind already shifting to whatever came next, whatever mission or operation or crisis would require the specific skills that had made her legendary among a community that most people didn't know existed. In their F-22s, now back at Buckley and parked in hardened shelters, Harrison and Ghost were completing their post-flight paperwork when their commander entered the ready room with a classified message folder. Colonel Marcus Webb was a veteran of multiple combat deployments, a pilot whose own achievements were substantial, but even he seemed slightly awed by what he'd just read. "Gentlemen, lady," he said, using the informal address that indicated this wasn't an official briefing, "I've just been informed by some very high-ranking people that you two had the privilege of sharing airspace with a pilot who may be the most accomplished aviator currently serving in any capacity in the United States military." Webb placed the folder on the table, its red cover indicating classified material that would be read and then secured without copies made. Call sign Valor, real name Maya Richardson, former test pilot at Edwards, current special operations asset whose specific mission I'm not clear to know. Her record includes 57 emergency landing scenarios in experimental aircraft, development of 12 new emergency procedures now used across multiple platforms, and survival of situations that resulted in ejection recommendations for every other pilot who encountered them. The commercial aircraft she just saved would have been number 58 if we were counting, but her work isn't acknowledged publicly, isn't documented in any records accessible to normal classification levels. Harrison and Ghost exchanged glances, their standing at attention maneuver suddenly feeling inadequate to honor what they'd just learned. "Sir, we'd like to submit a formal recognition report," Harrison said, and Webb nodded. "Already anticipated. I'll be forwarding your report along with my own endorsement to a few very select people who will ensure that Valor's actions today are properly documented in the places where such things matter. She won't receive a public medal, won't be interviewed on television, won't have her picture in any magazine. But the people who need to know will know, and that's what matters in this community." 3 days later, Maya was back at her real workplace, a facility that existed on no maps and appeared on no organizational charts, buried in the Nevada desert where experimental aircraft had been flown since before most current pilots were born. She sat in a conference room with 3 other people whose names would mean nothing to the public but whose influence shaped American military aviation in ways that would become apparent only decades later. The briefing covered her actions at Denver, the compromise of her cover identity, and the operational adjustments required to keep her effective in her current role. "The good news is that your intervention saved a lot of lives and potentially prevented a fleet-wide safety issue," said General Patricia Morrison, no relation to the Transcan captain, a woman whose own flying career had included achievements that remained classified decades after the fact. "The bad news is that your face is now on television, your name is in FAA reports, and at least a few people in the aviation community are going to start asking questions about who you really are and what you really do. We're going to have to adjust your operational profile, probably move you into more direct roles rather than cover positions." Maya nodded, accepting the assessment. She'd known the risks when she'd knocked on that cockpit door, had made the conscious choice that saving lives outweighed operational security. "What's the next assignment?" she asked, because that's what mattered, not the complications or the changes to her cover but the work that still needed to be done. The general smiled slightly, recognizing the focus that made Maya exceptional even among the exceptional people in this room. "There's a program starting up, very classified, very high risk. They need a test pilot who can handle experimental aircraft with flight characteristics that push the edges of current understanding. Interested? Always, Maya replied, and the meeting moved forward into details that would remain classified for years, discussions of aircraft that existed only as computer models and wind tunnel mock-ups, of flight regimes where the atmosphere grew thin and the margin for error disappeared entirely. This was her world, had always been her world, the place where physics and skill and courage intersected in ways that produced either breakthrough or catastrophe depending on milliseconds and decisions and training so deeply embedded that it functioned faster than conscious thought. Back in Denver, Captain Morrison was completing his own paperwork, the incident report that would become part of his permanent record and part of aviation history, a case study in how catastrophic system failures could be survived through extraordinary intervention. He tried to find Maya Richardson after the emergency, wanted to thank her properly, wanted to understand more about who she was and how she'd acquired the knowledge that had saved his aircraft. But she disappeared as mysteriously as she'd appeared, leaving only her statement to the FAA and a phone number that rang through to a generic voicemail box that accepted messages but never returned calls. The investigation into the brake system failure ultimately revealed what Maya had suspected, a manufacturing defect in hydraulic seals that had affected 17 aircraft, a tiny flaw in the seal material that caused degradation under specific pressure and temperature conditions. The FAA issued an emergency airworthiness directive, every affected aircraft was grounded and inspected, and mechanics found incipient brake failures in 3 other planes that would have resulted in similar emergencies if not caught in time. Maya's quick diagnosis had prevented potentially multiple crashes, saved potentially hundreds more lives beyond the 237 aboard her flight. She received a letter from the FAA administrator, carefully worded to acknowledge her contribution without revealing details that remained classified, thanking her for her expertise and assistance during a critical aviation emergency. It joined other letters in a safe deposit box that contained her various commendations and awards, most of which bore classifications that prevented them from being displayed or even acknowledged publicly. Maya read it once, filed it away, and returned her attention to the work that consumed her days, the testing and evaluation and problem-solving that pushed aviation forward in increments measured in performance data and safety improvements. Years later, at a conference of test pilots and aviation professionals, Morrison would tell the story of Transcon 447 to a room full of people who understood what true skill looked like, who could appreciate the precision required to execute a controlled ground loop in a commercial airliner without destroying the aircraft or killing anyone aboard. He described the woman who'd appeared in his cockpit like a guardian angel, whose calm voice and certain knowledge had guided him through maneuvers he'd never imagined attempting. And in the back of the room, someone would smile slightly and remember that day in Denver, remember the sound of tires screaming on concrete and engines roaring in reverse thrust and a voice counting down the runway distance with absolute certainty that physics would cooperate if handled correctly. But Maya wouldn't be at that conference, would be somewhere else entirely, probably in a cockpit of some experimental aircraft that most people didn't know existed, testing some system or procedure that would eventually save lives in ways that would never be attributed to her work. That was the nature of what she did, the silent service that happened in classified spaces and secured facilities, the work that made aviation safer and more capable without any public acknowledgement or recognition. The F-22 pilots who'd stood at attention would remember her call sign, would pass the story to other pilots in quiet conversations that added to the legend. The people she'd saved would remember her face, would wonder sometimes about the woman who'd known exactly what to do when disaster loomed. And Maya would continue forward, carrying her skills and knowledge and experience into whatever challenge came next, whatever emergency or crisis or impossible situation required someone who could look at catastrophe and see the narrow path to survival that existed if you had the courage and training to walk it. Call sign Valor, a name that meant something to the few who knew, a symbol of the highest level of aviation excellence, worn by a woman who preferred shadows to spotlights but who would step forward without hesitation when lives depended on the knowledge she'd spent decades acquiring. The sun set over the Nevada desert, painting the sky in colors that only people who flew at high altitude truly appreciated, and somewhere in that vastness an aircraft climbed toward the edge of space, carrying a pilot whose name appeared on no public roster but whose contributions to aviation would echo through decades of safer flights and better procedures and lives saved by techniques she'd pioneered. The work continued, silent and essential, the kind of service that defined the best of those who flew, who tested, who pushed the boundaries of what aircraft could survive and what pilots could achieve when excellence was the only acceptable standard. Transcon 447 flew again after repairs and recertification, its landing gear replaced, its brake systems thoroughly inspected and upgraded, its pilots forever changed by their encounter with someone whose skill exceeded anything their training had prepared them to recognize. The passengers scattered to their destinations, most carrying stories of the terrifying landing that they'd share for years, none quite understanding how close they'd come to death or how remarkable had been the intervention that saved them. But in the world where legends were made and remembered by those who understood what true achievement looked like, the story of valor in Transcon 447 would be told and retold, each version adding slightly to the mythos of a pilot whose career existed mostly in classified files but whose impact on aviation safety was real and substantial and ongoing. The F-22 pilots who'd stood at attention would remember her call sign, would pass the story to other pilots in quiet conversations that added to the legend. And Maya would continue forward, carrying her skills and knowledge into whatever challenge came next, ready to step forward without hesitation when lives depended on the knowledge she'd spent decades acquiring. Call sign Valor, a name that meant something profound to the few who knew, a symbol of the highest level of aviation excellence.